Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Julia. I was an admission officer at Haverford College, an outside reader for Emory University, and I currently work at Milton Academy, an independent boarding and day school outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. Good morning, friends. I'm coming to you from Durham, North Carolina, where I'm staying with my daughters who are roommates here. And I'm off in about an hour to the SACAC conference, where about 300 admission officers and 300 college counselors will meet for some professional development. But before I get into today's preview of what you can expect, I'm basking in the overflow or the overglow because last night we had our first ever YCBK Meet and Greet. And we had 33 people come from, I think it was 7 different states. I know we had Pennsylvania, Virginia, Massachusetts, obviously North Carolina, Georgia, Missouri, actually Wisconsin, California, Florida. We had a couple people that drove over 4 hours just to come. And it was a combination of a few things. We had maybe about 8 college counselors that were in for the conference. So they were able to come from lots of locations. We caught people on their spring break who were already in the Research Triangle visiting colleges. And then we just had our loyal listeners, both from North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland. And it was a combination of all of us. It was a lot of fun. It was so cool getting to meet you guys and hear your stories. And my daughter spent 3 full days baking food for everybody. So that will never happen again. But it was just a lot of fun. I want to thank everybody who came out, and it was overwhelmingly successful. And so no promises, but if possible, we're going to try to do this in Los Angeles at the national conference. And hopefully you'll get to meet the co-hosts that weren't there, Vince and Julia, who go to the national conference. And we'll see how many of us will be there. I know I'll be there. I know Susan's actually presenting, and we'll see if Lynda and Lisa are able to make it. So lots of fun. And then next year, SACAC is in Atlanta, so no promises, but I'm hoping to do something in our backyard of our place. So we'll see if we can pull that off. But a few other announcements before we get into today's episode. So there's still one last chance for you to sign up for Scholar Match. So they have their last information session the 26th, which is tomorrow, if you're listening to it on Monday. And it's a morning time slot. We have a link in our show notes to both the volunteer contact form as well as the time details there. You can also go to scholarmatch.org and see everything there. So one last chance to sign up to be a college counselor, college coach, to help a gifted and talented under-resourced student with the college process and find out maybe this is your maybe, who knows, maybe you have a college counseling future, and it's also a way for you to test drive and see if this is something that you'd like to do maybe later in life. I also want to mention we have had 57 people sign up already to hear Andy Strickler for a 1-hour Q&A where you can ask him anything. You've heard Andy now. He's been on here a few times, both done a Connecticut College Spotlight for us. He's also done a interview on how reading files from a large school group is different from a small school group or an average size school group. You know his style. You know, you ask a question, you get a straight answer. It gives you transparency. And so we encourage you to sign up for that. We're very excited. You just go to yourcollegeboundkid.com and you'll see the events tab. That's April 3rd. That's a Thursday. That's 5:30 Eastern, 7:30 Central, 6:30 Mountain, and 5:30 Pacific. 1 hour, any question. We'd love to have you join us. And if you don't have any questions, be a fly on the wall because there's going to be some great questions. And so far, you guys have proven to me there's a demand for this. So we're going to continue adding more thought leaders with robust college admissions experience. And next up, Karen Christoph. So Karen has also worked at 5 institutions like Andy, has also been doing this for more than 30 years, is also a past YCBK interviewee, and she just got a wealth of knowledge. She's also been in multiple locations, okay, currently at Colorado College, but she's also been in many places along the East Coast, including Smith College for a really long time. So get your questions ready. Next Monday, I'll hopefully be able to announce the date for that and the time and what the sign-up sheet ready. And you guys have convinced me there's an interest in this. So I'm going to continue to do it. I'm not promising how many we'll do, but I'll say this. We'll do at least 6 a year, at least. So I'm going to feel it out and see what the attendance is like. And the maximum we would do would be once a month. The minimum we would do would be 6 times a year. And so I'm just going to continue to see, what the interest level's like and whether people find it to be an enjoyable, profitable experience. But I'm convinced it will be, having now done 4 of these. We just took a four-year break from the first 3, but we're back. All right, today's episode, it's an interesting one. So Julia has returned back to admission file reading. Now, she hasn't left her job in Boston schools, but she's doing admissions file reading, and it's been 8 years. And she's going to share with us what she's observed, how students have changed, how things have changed in the 8 years since she last read files. I think you're going to enjoy it. And friends, we have a brand new interview I'm really excited about. It's with Marjorie Betley, and she wears a couple hats. So Marjorie's actually a senior associate director of admissions at the University of Chicago. So a very experienced admission officer at the University of Chicago, but she's also the executive director of the STARS College Netwok. Now, STARS is a really, really clever acronym. It stands for Small Towns and Rural Students. And Lynda's doing this interview with Marjorie to be a 3-parter. And they're looking at what are these 16 schools that are currently part of the network doing to get more small town students and more rural students to their campuses. Now, Lynda fooled me on this one. She's like, Stuck, I don't know if you're going to like this interview. I'm really not sure. So I'm listening and I'm editing and I'm like waiting for the hammer to drop. I'm like, what is this big mess up that she's talking about? And I go all the way through and it's getting better and better and better all the way through. And then I finish, I'm like, you lowballed me. But I was happy to be lowballed. But it's a good lesson. Under promise and overperform. Fantastic interview that Lynda conducts over the next 3 weeks. I think you're really going to like it. The only thing I didn't like is I was waiting for Lynda to say, you need to come back and do a deep dive on the University of Chicago. But I'll talk to Lynda later about that because I definitely would love Marjorie to come back and do a deep dive on the University of Chicago. So that's our interview for today. So I hope you enjoy. We'll now transition to Julia talking about what she's learned being back in the admissions file reading process. So, Julia, I have a question for you because you're back to reading, which excites me. Yeah. And it's been a while. Even that we all read all of our students, applications all the time. But there's another lens when you're back to doing college reading. Is there anything that you feel you can share that you've observed in, say, 10 years ago till now, reading files, either trends or anything you've seen, anything that you think our listeners would find interesting?
I think, and this is not to scare anyone, it actually gives me a lot of hope, but you hear all the time, I hear from my colleagues on the other side of the desk, like, oh, record number of applicants, the pool is really strong. I mean, I didn't think they were lying to me, but it had been an 8-year break from me reading applications. And I would say that, so the school I was reading for sort of like has a Harvard type scale. It's a numerical scale. And if, let's say, 1 is the highest number, when I was reading before, I would be considering maybe 3s and 4s and 5s for a regular decision. And this time around, I could really only be considering 1s, maybe some 2s. There just wasn't any space. There were so many great applicants.
So you've personally seen how it's gotten more competitive in your 8 years.
Way more competitive. Yes. Yeah. And I'm not saying that to scare people. Again, this is a highly selective school that also it shrunk in selectivity by about 12% since the last time I read for them. It also is a school that admits an awful lot of students from early decisions. So the squeeze on regular is much larger than at other places. But I was very thankful I didn't have to be in the committee room, because I don't know how they would have made those decisions. Because pretty much every application I read, I was like, oh, this would have been an automatic admit, no problems 8 years ago. Like, it wouldn't have been someone we needed to pull down. It wouldn't have been someone we didn't have room for. And I also think students are a lot more, again, this is a really small group that I'm reading, but also the students are awfully intentional. They're really good about their demonstrated interests. They're really good about, they've learned to play the game a bit better.
They really have. I've noticed that on the counseling side over the years.
Yeah.
Students have definitely learned how to, in those custom questions, how to answer them better. I mean, there's still a lot of people that don't do them well, but they're better than there's more savviness.
Yes, big time.
Than there used to be.
Yes. And I think I wasn't giving students, as terrible as this is, I wasn't giving them enough credit. I remember when I was going through my reader training, we were addressing the supplemental questions, the supplemental essays for this college. And to me, that was always sort of, both colleges I read for, that was usually the tip-in. If the student was right on the cusp, it was sort of how they answered those supplemental essays. And I'm probably spend the most time with my students on their supplemental essays. And I'm like, nope, go back. I'm really hard on them. And so I'm in reader training, and they ask us to vote what number would we assign this? And out of, the 10 readers I was with, I had by far the lowest. And, the director of admission was like, this is a very solid supplemental essay for us. This is great. And I was like, what? Oh my gosh. So it actually made me realize I've been working with hyper talented students.
Well, there's also, it's not just hyper talented. I find there's a big difference coming from independent schools and public schools.
Well, yes, they have all the resources to know who they are and how to articulate that and how to articulate the fit to that particular
And honestly,
school,
that's really what I feel. Like, sometimes when I sit in reading processes and I see kids just getting dinged a lot on those custom questions, I think sometimes it's not fair, because I find it's one of the most coachable parts of this process.
Yes. Oh, totally.
It's totally coachable. And it's just, if you don't have that coaching,
right?
Like, if you take your same students and you don't put them in your context and go put them somewhere else, they would produce people don't know the level of specificity that's expected, the amount of research you're expected, the extent to which you have to make the case that you're a match, and how stuff they think is being specific is just super general, that you read all the time, and it's super general. And that's just what I see. And so to me, it's just one of the, I'm very sympathetic to the proponents of testing that push back and say, hey, don't tell me testing is the only thing that is correlated with social class.
Totally. Yes.
Because the writing and the coaching on the writing is, and then your ability to have an athletic hook or music or something that you honed from age 3 or 4, that your parents might have spent $80,000 over 12 years for lessons, or maybe 150, depending on how much you travel and get lessons. Like there's a lot of things in this process that are totally correlated to social class. It's not just the testing. And I think that that's a completely valid argument that the testing proponents push back and say.
I would totally agree. And for our and please know for the listeners that maybe your child doesn't go to a independent school or well-resourced public school, that we also, admission officers, do read with that lens, right? So I was not expecting the rural first generation student from Hawaii to have the same sort of essay as the student from a New York City private school. So, but I was still very impressed with students who had zero contact with the college I was reading for, that had a really, it gives me a lot of hope for the younger generation, and that something, and maybe it's a self-selecting group of students that apply to the school I was reading for, but students are more loud and proud about who they are. And so even for the students that didn't have that kind of coaching or those kind of resources, there was still really such great texture in their supplemental essays. Even if the mechanics were a little off, or, they wouldn't be comparable to some other schools. I was really impressed by the what I would consider the average supplemental essay answer was far better than I remember reading.
Yeah, yeah. It's, I feel like, we're in the information age. And
Yes, also
it's a
true. Yeah,
combination of many more people are working with private college coaches, and there's a lot more information available on the internet than ever before.
right. For free.
Yeah, for free. I still see a lot of really bad first drafts that people think are good.
Yeah.
But I also see some people that, I'd say, especially once they learn how to do one really, really well, then they can translate that to other schools.
They do. Yes. Yeah. So yes. And in fact, the college I read for was, when I could tell, just because I'm sure you could too, Mark, I could tell that it was like fully recycled, and then the name was just kind of put in.
Sure.
Whereas we know that ultimately, and colleges know that too, that it will be a little recycled because they're asking similar questions. But even those ones, like, were not dinged as much as I might ding my own student for that. So it did make me realize maybe, I'm great that I expect really high of my over-resourced students. But I was really kind of pleasantly surprised that it was actually okay for the college, that they understood that this might be, this could absolutely be used for our peer institutions, and we're okay with that.
Did you have any instance where somebody never caught that that they listed listed another name in an essay? And like, what would you say that happens more than 1% of the time? What percentage of the time would you say that happens? And then how do you react to that?
Yes, totally. Actually, so I second read all files. So they had already been read by the territory person. And I only read files that were going to be considered for admission as well. And I had, I would say I had maybe more than 3% that a student neglected to do that. I'll also call out my counselor friends, because gosh, did I see a lot of mistakes in counselor recs.
You mean with listing names, or just
listing names of schools, or obviously also not being awesome in how they talked about the student, in terms of, like, even the student's name was switched a couple times, or pronoun use. But
Susan has also talked about, like, sharing things that would be violations too.
Oh my gosh!
That you really are not allowed to share without permission too. No. Yeah.
Yes, that was actually really alarming to me. I thought a lot of that had been left behind. So that was, but it's good. It's good for me. It's a good reminder for me in what I should be writing and what I shouldn't be writing. But you're right, Mark. I did see it more often than not. And as much as I really wanted to ding the student, the college I work for is much more forgiving than I am. So what I would see is usually the first reader might highlight it in the application. So I would see it, and it maybe went into the prose, but these were still students that were going to be considered for admission. So it wasn't enough to tip them out. Now, I don't know what happened in the committee room. That could be the thing, but...
Friends, literally on my drive from Atlanta to Durham for our YCBK gathering and the SACAC conference, I spoke to a dad that I worked with last year, and I'm working with again for a second student. And we got to talking about child number 1, who's a freshman in college. And everything actually worked out okay for her, and she's really happy where she's at. So I want to say that first so I don't alarm you with what I'm about to share. But the dad says to me in the conversation, he says, did my daughter ever tell you what happened with her teacher recommendation? And I said, no. The dad proceeded to tell me that one of his student's teachers was really proud of the recommendation that she wrote for the student. So the teacher shared the rec with the student. And in the teacher rec, there was a lot of very confidential information about mental health challenges that the student had experienced that the student did not want colleges to know. She didn't feel she needed to share it. If you remember my interview with Barnard's admission director, Christina Lopez, we talked about disclosing mental health. And as she said, we're not your mental health therapists, and you shouldn't feel obligated to have to share everything. So that's the student was exercising her right for privacy. And while the letter was effusive in its glowing recommendation, she shouldn't have shared those things. It was a violation of the student's rights. It completely crossed an ethical boundary to share that information. I'm just hearing this too often. Susan has talked about the things that she reads that counselors and teachers share that completely crosses the line without the student's permission. And now Julia's sharing this. And here I have this incident literally one day after I recorded with Julia. So I'm just giving a free tip here on Monday's episode. If you have confidential health or mental health experiences you do not want a teacher or counselor to share, let them know that you regard that as personal and you're asking them not to share that in their letter. You need to do it politely and respectfully, but it's just a little free tip on a Monday episode. Awesome. Well, I always love to get insights from the reading room. I wish that I could actually go back and do that again. I think that it would be such a rich experience, and I'm thrilled that you're able to get in there. I'm glad that you and Susan are able to come and share those insights for us, because it's been a while since I read all my student stuff a lot, and I see a lot in there from them, but there's still the context of having a rubric and putting it through the rubric and having all those people apply for those spots. I mean, even you've said, Julia, because you read all your students like you too, but it's still been, there's been educational value for you to go back and do that again, even that hugely, you've done that. Hugely. Yeah. So awesome. So keep sharing those insights with our listeners. And thank you so much. Thank you, Julia, for all your contributions. I really appreciate here you are reading files and then all the stuff you're doing, counseling, and then coming on here on this podcast. I don't think I can thank you enough for all your contributions.
Oh, no, thank you. Thanks for allowing me to make them. I appreciate it.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Hi, this is Lynda with Your College Bound Kid, and I'm excited to be talking today with Marjorie Betley, who is the Executive Director of the Small Town and Rural Students College Network, known as STARS, Deputy Director of Admissions at University of Chicago, and the Trot Director of the Emerging Rural Leaders Program at U Chicago. So, you can probably tell from all of those titles, we're going to be talking about rural students today. Marjorie, that's a lot of hats to wear. So if you would, please share with our listeners a little bit about you and your journey and how you came to be involved with STARS.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for having me. I am originally from a small town in North Georgia. And I think that my identity as coming from that small town area is really important to the work that I do, in that I went to the University of Chicago for undergraduate and graduate school. So I've been here at the university for more than half my life at this rate. And love it. I fell in love with it, never wanted to leave. I worked abroad for a few years as an archaeologist and then came back and got my graduate degree and wanted to get involved in something at the university that I love so much. So college admissions was a really nice, easy kind of like transition for me from academia to the things that I love to do anyways, traveling and talking to kids about college and options and things like that. So that is how I got started at the University of Chicago admissions office. And then probably 2018-ish was right around the time someone in the office was moving on to amazing things, getting their graduate degree. And I was looking at the org chart, and there happened to be a small little bullet under the org chart that said the small school talent search. And I thought that looked really interesting. And I was like, oh, I came from a small town myself. So what is this? What is the small school talent search? And that started a really kind of a great deep dive into the history of the University of Chicago's recruitment of rural students, which goes back to the 1960s, through the small school talent search. So that had really focused on small schools in the Midwest specifically. And it came at a really interesting time in the university's history where they were facing a lot of enrollment challenges and they needed to do more in their own backyard. So they created a scholarship program for these small schools to bring students to the university. And it has existed ever since in one form or another. It had not been touched or changed or updated in many, many, many years when I saw that, and I asked for it to be added to my portfolio. But the timing was fortuitous, I would say, because that year we had an alum, a trustee actually, reach out and he wanted to get more information about how we were supporting rural students on campus and also what our general demographics looked like in terms of rural. So how many rural students did we have? How many rural high schools did we visit? Things like that. Those were actually really hard questions for us to answer because it was not a demographic that we had tracked very closely. We didn't entirely know how to define it at the time. That started the process of a lot of research into, how do you define rural? Who's rural on our campus? What have we been doing through the small school talent search? Has it worked? Has it not? How are we supporting students? Yeah, and that the results that we found were not great, let's say. So right around 3% of our campus we could identify as rural at that time, given that more than 20% of the United States is rural in terms of high school students just alone. It wasn't great. So that was something that we took away from the research. The other was that the small school talent search hadn't been working the way that we wanted it to, right? It wasn't bringing students. And the other piece of it that I wasn't working well at was supporting students. I think the dropout rate from that program was like 70%.
Wow.
It was very high. So yeah, we really needed to address what we were doing and how we were approaching things. And this alum came back and he said, wow, this is embarrassing. We need to do something about it. And that created the Emerging Rural Leaders program. So Emerging Rural Leaders was designed as an early outreach and engagement program for high school students in their freshman year of high school or their junior year of high school. It's a residential program, so students come to campus, they live in the dorms, they eat in the dining halls, they take classes, they test drive college for the first time. And that was a really successful program. Building those pipelines was something we hadn't done as an institution before. And part of that program was creating my position, which would not only start working with those students their freshman year of high school, but then also follow them their entire time at the university. So I am more of that to and through kind of advisor for students, and I meet with them every quarter. I host socials, I do one-on-one check-ins, and I have my first cohort of Emerging Rural Leaders graduating this year, which I'm very excited about. So Emerging Rural Leaders worked well in many ways. So we were supporting students. We were also seeing more students applying. We went from 3% of campus to 9% in the 5 years that we piloted Emerging Rural Leaders, which was awesome. And then that trustee came back and said, this is good work. It seems to be working. You've got some good best practices going. Now, how do you scale it? How do you take what's worked here and can you apply it to other institutions, other colleges and universities? Because that is a huge downside of being a highly selective institution, is that we are only able to impact a pretty small number of students in the grand scheme of things. So the idea was to create kind of a model of rural student recruitment and support and retention that could be used by any number of institutions, or really any institution, public, private, large, small, liberal arts college, tech school. So that was the idea of the network, kind of where it was born out of.
Okay. This is an opportune time for me to give some disclosures here. My daughter is a student at University of Chicago. We are from a rural area, and the benefactor that you're talking about, Byron Trott, is from our area. He went to high school about 5 miles away from my home, but my student did not attend the rural leadership program. But anyway, I wanted to share that. So can you give just a quick overview of the STARS College Network and the mission?
Absolutely, yeah. So the STARS College Network, that's that Small Town and Rural Students College Network, is a consortium of 16 colleges and universities. And they do really run the gamut. They're meant to be a breadth of institutions. So you've got publics, privates, larger, smaller, liberal arts colleges, some tech schools like MIT and Caltech. You've got schools across the United States. So it is really a national focus. Which is another topic at some point I'd love to talk about, because rural is inherently geography based. It is anchored in geography, which means it tends to be inherently pretty fragmented. And that was something that we were noticing. All 16 of our institutions wanted to be doing more of this work, but we didn't see a nice strategic way to do that, to impact as many people as possible, to make sure that, we're also not, I think one of our deans put it this way that I loved, we're not just like moving the lawn chairs around for the same top rural students that want to go to our institutions, but we're really making big change, that we are really creating opportunities for a wide variety of students who live in rural America. So that was something that we were thinking about when we were thinking about, we want a really wide variety of institutions with different levels of selectivity and different programs that they offer and different experiences, because we do strongly believe that there are different fits for different kids. And there are more than 4,500 different colleges and universities out there for a good reason, right? There are different opportunities and options available to students. What you do often see in rural America is that students don't get to see the full breadth of opportunity that is available to them. Many times they are looking kind of within a very close radius. And especially in rural America, when we talk about that, there's a lot of education deserts. There aren't a lot of variety of different schools or options that might be nearby. So you might kind of default to the closest option. That's not always the best fit for every single student. It can be a really good option, a really good fit for students. I think that's important to say about college in general too, right? College is not necessarily the absolute best fit for every single student. I think there's lots of research that says that it can be incredibly beneficial in many ways, but especially economically. And that's great. We really want that. And we want students to understand that that is something that college can be for them. It can be a great option economically, academically, socially. Like there are lots of ways that college can be a benefit for students. And the right college is the best benefit for that student. So helping students make an informed decision was part of the impetus. It's really twofold, right? So if you think about it, there's two routes to STARS and its goals. One is general college access, right? Help students understand what college can be like, what their options are, how to apply, how financial aid works at a really wide variety of schools. And those schools don't have to be the ones that students end up at. But if we've helped a student understand that they have lots of opportunities and options available to them, and that college can be accessible and affordable if they have all the right information. That's step one. That's goal number one. Goal number two is then to also build those pipelines at our 16 institutions, right? Because we recognize that as institutions, rural students are underrepresented on our campuses. We're not reflective of the United States in the way that we would like to be. So goal number two is to build our pipelines to support our students on our campuses. And goal number one is really kind of opening the door. I like to call it the ecosystem of opportunity, creating a healthier ecosystem that students know, here are what all my options are. Here's what I think I want to do. Here's the best place for me academically, financially, socially, whatever that looks like. And yeah, those are the two big goals there.
And I love that. I have always said, it's absolutely okay if you end up at the college in your backyard, but that should be by choice, not by default. And I just want to quickly run through the schools that we're talking about, just so our listeners get an idea of the variety of schools. We're talking about Brown, Caltech, Case Western, Colby College, Columbia, MIT, Northwestern, Ohio State, U Chicago, University of Iowa, University of Maryland, USC, Wisconsin, Vanderbilt, WashU, and Yale. So you've got everything from Ivy League to small liberal arts colleges, to those technical schools like MIT and Caltech and state flagships. So definitely a wide variety. And you talked a little bit about the focus on rural students, giving them some options and building pipelines to these 16 schools. Is part of that the prioritizing rural students? Are you looking at that as part of the enrollment cliff that is coming up, or improving diversity on campus, or both, or something in addition to that?
To be honest, the enrollment cliff never came up in like initial conversations, but definitely the idea of, in order to create a robust kind of environment on our campuses that encompasses all of the United States, we were falling very far behind in that. So I would say, when we talk about diversity, I like to talk about a diversity of diversity, because we so often think of diversity as one thing. But we are thinking about the diversity of geography and socioeconomics, and we're looking at students who are first generation or low income, and like the diversity of many different things does need to be represented on a campus, in order to make our classrooms, that those conversations happen and those conversations be more meaningful. You have to have different voices, and you have to have different perspectives, and you have to make it welcoming also, so that those different voices and different perspectives feel like they can be heard. So those are the sorts of things that we were really honing in on when we started thinking about rurality. And I think the other thing that I think is important about rural, and when we talk about rural, is like, when we say rurality or when we say a rural area, many people think of what they are most familiar with. And if you know one rural area, you know one rural area. They are inherently very different from place to place. Rural Missouri is going to be very different than rural New Mexico, or my students who are, I have one, he's a 5th generation lobsterman who lives on a tiny island off of Maine. I have students who are from rural Alaska and Hawaii. And it's just, there's no one way to define rural. So it is also inherently diverse in and of itself, which is kind of cool. But yeah, when we think about building a class and a classroom that has really good conversations with different perspectives and different backgrounds represented, rural has to be a part of that conversation.
I'm so glad that you gave those examples of the diversity of rural students. Too often it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And part of that comes with, living in flyover states, or even places that aren't flyover, like rural Alaska, and things like that. So I'm glad that you shared that. And you shared that 20% of students in the country are rural students. And I think that's a number that will probably surprise people. I mean, there are a lot of them out there. So I'm glad to hear that number. Tell me, why these 16 schools? How did this group come together?
Yeah, these 16 schools were all partners that we had worked with in the past, and knew that they wanted to be doing this work. So I think there are many factors when we talk about why rural schools tend to be overlooked. But one of the biggest ones when we think about it from a college admissions standpoint is that it can be expensive to visit rural high schools. at the end of the day, many institutions are thinking about their budgets and their staff numbers and their ROI. And when you can go visit 5 schools in New York and meet with 500 students in a day, it looks a lot better on paper than visiting a rural high school or 2 and only visiting with maybe 10 students. So it definitely, there are many, many reasons that the kind of all has built up over time, but that these were schools that wanted to do the work, that had been trying to do the work in many ways on their own, and would really benefit from the additional support that's offered through the Stars College Network. We're all benefiting from that collaboration and the opportunity to bring different schools, that bring different audiences together. So yeah, these 16, they were all schools that we knew were working in this area and wanted to do more, and we had worked with them in the past, and it's meant to be a pilot. So the idea was this original funding from the trustee, the same trustee who founded the Emerging Rural Leaders Program. In 4 years, we would take a look at how we'd been doing, the numbers, what growth we had seen. And actually recently, so we put together our first report. We haven't even been around for a year. We launched in April of last year as a network, and we put together our initial kind of work that we've been doing over this past 9 months. And the numbers looked really good. We were able to reach exponentially so many more students, schools, families, communities than we ever could individually. And everyone's so excited. We will most likely be expanding sooner rather than later. Then we don't have to wait 4 years. We can continue to grow.
That is great news. So when you say continue to grow, does that mean add additional schools to the network?
Yeah, we would hopefully be adding a handful of additional schools over the next year or so. And we want to have more geographic diversity in those schools. We want to have different kinds of schools. There's been conversations about adding things like HBCUs and women's colleges, and really, really showing students the breadth of kind of what is available to them.
Amazing. I love it.
Friends, this concludes the first part of our 3-part interview. I hope you'll join us next week for part 2 of 3. Friends, on Thursday's episode, Julie and I finally get to the article that appeared in the Bowdoin Orient called "Where Are the Boys? Where Are the Men?" What colleges are doing and how they're struggling to attract young men to attend their colleges. And then we'll have a speak pipe question. I promise you that. You're just going to have to tune in to see which one it is. And then for our interview, Lydia Dagenet is back. And this time we're talking about how does law school admissions work? It'll be a 2-part interview. And for those of you who like international schools, Kevin Newton is back for a spotlight for a really important school that a lot of students look at, University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And friends, remember, it's not where you go. It's not where you go. It's not where you go. But it's what you do when you get there. And it's what you do when you get out of there. That is what will determine your career trajectory. See you on Thursday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Lynda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stylianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Lynda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.